The morning frost had turned every window in the valley white, thick enough that no one could see through their own glass until the fire had been going for an hour. Smoke leaned sideways out of every chimney, and inside most cabins the walls wept. Water ran down the log seams in thin black lines, pooled on the sills, and froze there again by midday. There was one cabin where none of that happened. Otis Bramwell noticed it first because his dog would not stop pulling toward it. He followed the animal up the frozen path, past the woodpile, past the porch, and put his bare hand flat against the outer wall of Halvard Solberg's cabin. He expected cold log, the same cold every other wall in the valley gave back at this hour. Instead, he felt something he did not have a word for. Not warm, not exactly, but nowhere near as cold as it should have been. He knocked. No one answered right away, because inside a boy was still sleeping without a blanket pulled over his face, which had not happened once since the first snow. Word of a stranger's wall does not travel fast in a frontier winter, but it travels. By the end of that week, 3 more men had come to touch the same wall, and none of them left with a joke on their lips, the way they had in October. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice. Halvard Solberg had built his cabin 2 years before, using skills he had carried across an ocean rather than learned on this land. Back in Norway, he had spent almost 20 years fitting planks below the waterline of merchant ships, work that taught him to think about wood the way most farmers thought about weather, as something that could betray you slowly from the inside long before it betrayed you all at once. That winter, he was building alone in every sense that mattered. His wife, Ingrid, had died the previous spring, not from anything as dramatic as the frontier stories like to tell. A fever had taken her over 11 days, and Halvard had spent every one of them at her side instead of in the field, which was part of why the harvest that followed her death was thinner than it should have been. Now, autumn was closing fast, and the woodpile behind the cabin was smaller than it needed to be for a full season. His older son, Peter, was 12 and old enough to see the arithmetic for himself. His younger son, Elias, was 7 and had started coughing in a way that worried Halvard more than he let either boy see. The math was simple and unforgiving. Not enough wood, not enough grain stored, and a cabin that, like every other cabin in the valley, lost heat through its log walls almost as fast as the stove could put it in. Halvard had watched it happen the winter before, watched frost bloom on the inside of the same walls that faced a roaring fire, and he had said nothing about it to anyone, because at the time he had not yet decided what he thought the problem actually was. He decided that autumn, sitting at the table with Ingrid's old measuring stick in his hand, he thought less like a frontier farmer and more like a man who had once been responsible for keeping salt water out of a wooden hull. A ship's hull was not one wall. It was 2, sometimes more, with a controlled space of air between them, an idea nobody in this valley had ever applied to a house. He did not tell his sons what he was planning that first night. He only wrote a short list of measurements on the back of an old shipping ledger. the only paper he had that felt sturdy enough for the idea. The wood he needed was already scarce. What he was about to propose would use more of it, not less, and there was no guarantee it would work at all. Halvard raised the idea to Otis Bramwell 3 days later, mostly because Otis was the only rancher in the valley who had never mocked him outright for being a shipbuilder trying to farm frozen ground. Otis listened, chewing on the inside of his cheek, and then said the thing that every practical man in that valley would have said. Wood does not grow back before the first snow. You cut it once, you stack it once, and you burn what you have. A second wall, built entirely inside the first one, was not clever to Otis. It was a man spending a season's worth of lumber and labor on a wall no one would ever see from outside, work that produced nothing you could sell, trade, or show a neighbor as proof of anything. Halvard did not argue the way Otis expected. He did not claim it would work. He only said that a ship crossing open water did not survive because its hull was thick. It survived because water was never allowed to sit against the wood for long. Somewhere in that idea, he told Otis, there had to be something worth trying on land. Otis was not convinced, and he said so plainly. He was not being cruel. He had buried a brother during a bad winter 15 years earlier, a man who had also tried something unproven when the cold came, and it had not ended well. Skepticism for Otis was not mockery. It was a scar with reasons behind it. Peter overheard the conversation from the woodpile, and that evening he asked his father directly whether the wood they had left was enough to waste on a wall inside a wall. Halvard did not have an answer that satisfied either of them completely. He only said that the wall they already had was not keeping his family warm, so calling it wasteful to change it made little sense to him. That night, Halvard walked the perimeter of the cabin with a lantern, running his hand along the outer logs the way he used to run his hand along a hull before a long voyage, feeling for the places where cold air was already finding its way in. There were more of those places than he wanted to count. He began cutting the first boards for the inner wall the following morning, before the frost had fully lifted, and before he had convinced anyone, including himself, that this would end any differently than Otis feared. The work itself was not glamorous, and it did not photograph well in memory the way a blizzard or a rescue might. It was measuring, cutting, fitting, and repeating day after day while the daylight grew shorter and the temperature dropped a little more each week. Halvard framed the second wall roughly 4 inches inside the original log wall, leaving a narrow air gap running the full height of the room. He used salvaged boards where he could, split from an old shed that had partially collapsed the previous spring, along with new lumber cut and dried as fast as the weather allowed, which was not very fast. Peter helped with the cutting, though his early boards ran slightly uneven, gaps that Halvard had to trim and refit by hand at the end of each day. He did not scold the boy for the mistakes. He had made worse ones himself decades earlier, learning to fit planks under the eye of an impatient shipwright who cared more about results than feelings. Elias, too young for the heavier work, was given the job of collecting wood shavings and small offcuts, sorting them into a pile his father promised would be useful later for packing gaps and for kindling. The boy took the job seriously, treating each curl of wood like something worth protecting, which, in a way, it was. Progress was slower than Halvard wanted. Some days the temperature dropped low enough that the boards resisted fitting cleanly, swelling and shrinking in ways that made precise joints harder to achieve. Other days, farm chores that could not be postponed, feeding animals, repairing a fence damaged by an early storm, 8 hours he had planned to spend on the wall. By the 3rd week of October, the inner wall was roughly 2/3 complete, running along the coldest side of the cabin first, the side that faced the ridge where wind came down hardest in the evenings. Otis stopped by twice during this period, saying little, though his eyes lingered on the growing pile of offcuts and the narrowing gap of daylight each visit. Halvard did not know at that point whether the design in his head would behave the way he expected once it was fully closed in. He only knew that the alternative, the wall his family already had failed them the winter before, and he was no longer willing to wait and see if it failed them worse this time. The first hard frost came earlier than expected in the final days of October, and for 2 nights the new wall seemed to be doing exactly what Halvard hoped. The air near the inner boards felt noticeably less biting than the air near the old outer logs, a difference small enough that only someone paying close attention would notice it at all. On the 3rd night, something changed. Halvard woke, before dawn, to a smell he recognized instantly and did not want to recognize, the faint, sour dampness of wood that had begun to hold moisture it should not be holding. He pulled a section of interior board away from the frame near the base of the wall and found what he had feared without letting himself say it aloud. The narrow air gap between the 2 walls, the very space meant to insulate his family, had become a trap for warm, moist air rising from the room, air that had nowhere to escape and was condensing against the colder outer logs. The wood at the base of the gap was already darkening, not rotted yet, but close enough to worry a man who had spent 2 decades watching ship timbers fail from exactly this kind of trapped moisture. Peter saw his father's face that morning and did not need to ask what was wrong. Elias, still coughing more than either of them liked, asked instead whether the new wall was going to make things worse instead of better. A question with no comfortable answer. Otis, hearing about the problem second-hand through a passing neighbor, did not gloat, though he had every reason to feel he had been right to doubt the plan. He simply asked Halvard, in a tone closer to concern than triumph, whether he intended to tear the second wall down before it spread further damage into logs that had taken 2 years to season properly. Halvard did not answer that question immediately. He sat with the darkened board in his hands for most of an afternoon, turning it over, running his thumb along the damp grain, thinking less like a man defending a mistake and more like a man trying to understand exactly where, in a system he thought he understood, the failure had actually occurred. The wall was not wrong. He was increasingly certain of that. But something about how he had closed it in was. Halvard spent that evening thinking not about cabins, but about ships, specifically about the wooden merchant vessels he had helped build and repair for nearly 20 years before crossing the ocean himself. A ship's hull was never sealed completely airtight between its layers. Shipwrights had learned, generations before Halvard was born, that trapped still air against wood, especially damp air, was more dangerous than air that was allowed to move. The solution on a ship was never total sealing. It was controlled movement, small gaps positioned deliberately so that damp air could rise and escape before it settled long enough to soak into timber. Halvard realized, sitting at his table with a scrap of paper and Ingrid's old measuring stick, that he had built his air gap as a sealed pocket instead of a breathing one. He had trapped the very air he needed to let go. The correction was smaller than the original wall itself, though it took him most of a day to execute carefully. He cut narrow, deliberate openings at the very base and at the very top of the air gap, on the wall's least exposed side, spaced roughly 18 inches apart. The openings were small, no wider than a man's finger, covered with a thin strip of cloth to keep insects and debris out, while still allowing air to pass. The principle was the same one that kept a ship's hold from rotting on a long voyage. Warm, moist air near the bottom would rise through the gap, exit through the openings near the top, and pull drier air in behind it near the base. A slow, continuous cycle instead of a sealed, stagnant pocket. Otis watched part of this work from a distance, arms crossed, saying little beyond a skeptical remark about whether a hole in a wall built to keep cold out made any sense at all. Halvard did not try to explain the physics in detail. He simply said that air needed somewhere to go, the same way a ship needed somewhere for water to go, and that sealing something completely was not always the same as protecting it. Peter, watching his father cut the small openings with far more care than the original wall boards had received, asked whether this was the last correction or whether there would be more. Halvard told him honestly that he did not know yet. He only knew this one made sense in a way the sealed gap had not. The first true test came with a hard freeze in early November, the kind of cold that settled in overnight and did not lift until well past noon the following day. Halvard checked the base of the inner wall before dawn, running his hand along the same section that had darkened with moisture 2 weeks earlier. It was dry. Not just dry, but noticeably cooler to the touch than the air in the room, a small, specific difference that told him something was happening inside that narrow gap, something closer to what he had intended from the start. He pressed his palm against the inner boards near the stove side of the cabin and felt a faint but real difference from the boards near the door. Evidence that the wall was behaving less like a single barrier and more like a system with its own quiet logic. Elias, curious as ever, pressed his small hand against the same spot his father had touched and asked what it meant that the wall felt different in different places. Halvard told him only that the wall was starting to learn how to hold on to warmth instead of losing it right away. A simplified answer that satisfied a 7-year-old far more than a lecture on stored heat would have. Peter was less easily convinced. He had watched the wall fail once already, and one dry morning after one hard freeze did not erase that memory. He asked his father directly whether this was proof the correction had worked, or simply a milder night than the one that had caused the moisture problem in the first place. Halvard admitted he could not be certain yet. A single cold night, however hard, was not the same as a full winter storm sustained over days. The wall had passed a small test, not the real one, and he told his sons plainly that they would not know the truth of it until conditions grew worse, not better. Otis, hearing about the dry wall from a neighbor rather than seeing it himself, offered no comment beyond a slow nod when he next passed Halvard on the frozen road, an absence of mockery that was, in its own quiet way, more meaningful than anything he might have said aloud. The real test, they all understood without saying it, was still ahead of them. Somewhere in the heart of the season, none of them could yet see the end of. By the second week of December, the pressure Halvard had been dreading finally arrived, not as a single dramatic night, but as a stretch of days that refused to let up. A heavy snowstorm rolled into the valley and stayed, burying the road, piling drifts against the north side of every building, and dropping temperatures low enough that even the hardiest ranchers kept their animals close to shelter. Elias's cough, which had never fully disappeared since autumn, grew worse during the second day of the storm. It was not yet the deep, rattling sound that terrified frontier parents most, but it was frequent enough and tired enough that Halvard found himself checking on the boy every hour through the night instead of sleeping. The cabin, for the first time, was being asked to prove itself over days rather than a single cold night. Halvard fed the stove carefully, rationing wood he knew had to last through a storm of uncertain length, while watching the inner wall for any sign that the moisture problem from November might return under sustained pressure rather than a brief freeze. For the first 2 days, the wall held. The base stayed dry. The small openings near the top and bottom of the gap continued their quiet exchange of air, and the difference in warmth near the stove side of the room remained steady. But Halvard understood, better than most in the valley, that sustained cold behaved differently than a single hard night. Materials that passed a short test sometimes failed a long one, a lesson every shipwright learned eventually, usually from a vessel that had not survived to explain why. Peter, watching his father's growing tension, finally asked the question neither of them had said aloud since November. What happened if the wall failed now, in the middle of a storm this size, with the road buried and no way to reach Otis or anyone else quickly? Halvard did not offer false comfort. He told his son the truth, that he believed in the design, but that belief was not the same as certainty, and that the only way to know for sure was to keep watching, keep adjusting if needed, and get through the storm one night at a time. Outside, the wind had begun to shift direction. Moving from the north towards the west, toward the one section of the cabin Halvard had reinforced last and trusted least. The wind shift came on the fourth night of the storm, and it came fast. What had been a steady northern gale for days suddenly swung toward the west, striking the section of the inner wall Halvard had finished in the greatest hurry back in October, the section with the least careful joinery and the narrowest margin for error. Halvard felt it before he saw any sign of trouble, a change in the sound of the wind against the cabin, sharper and more insistent than before. He rose from where he had been dozing near the stove and pressed his hand to the western section of the inner wall. It was colder than it should have been, colder than the other sections had felt, even during the hardest part of the November freeze. Elias's coughing had grown worse over the preceding hour, and Ingrid was no longer there to sit with the boy while Halvard worked, a fact that struck him harder in that moment than it had in months. He was alone in the decision that came next, with only Peter, now standing in the doorway of the boy's room, watching his father study the wall by lantern light. The choice in front of Halvard was not simple. He could seal the small ventilation openings near that section of wall completely, trapping in what little warmth remained, but risking the same moisture buildup that had darkened the boards in October. Or he could trust the system as built, leave the openings as they were, and hope the wind-driven cold did not overwhelm the wall's ability to manage the air moving through it. He thought in that moment less about ships and more about Ingrid, about the last winter they had spent together, about promises made without words to keep their son safe through whatever came next. He chose to trust the design he had corrected in November rather than panic and undo the very feature that had kept the wall dry through the freeze. Instead of sealing the gap, he packed additional wood shavings, the ones Elias had gathered and stored back in October, into the base of the wall along the western section, adding a layer of insulation without blocking the air path his correction depended on. It was a small adjustment made in the middle of the night, under pressure, with no certainty it would be enough. Then there was nothing left to do but wait for morning, listening to the wind test every seam of a wall built from grief, stubbornness, and 20 years of a life he had left behind on the other side of an ocean. The wind died down sometime before dawn, the way frontier storms often did, leaving behind a silence that felt almost as unsettling as the noise that came before it. Halvard had not slept. He checked the western section of the wall as soon as there was enough light to see clearly, running his hand along the boards, then along the base where he had packed the extra shavings hours earlier. Dry, not just dry, but distinctly warmer than the outer wall, a difference he could feel plainly even before he thought to measure anything. Later that morning, using a simple thermometer borrowed months earlier from a traveling merchant and never returned, Halvard recorded the temperature near the inner wall as roughly 21 degrees Fahrenheit, higher than the temperature just outside the cabin, a gap far wider than anything the neighboring homes were reporting that same morning. Elias's cough, while not gone, had eased overnight, and the boy slept later than he had in weeks, Tangled in blankets, he no longer needed to pull over his face. Word spread through the valley faster than the snow had time to melt. Otis arrived on the second day after the storm broke, saying nothing about October, about the doubts he had voiced, or about the offcuts and wasted lumber he had once predicted. He simply stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, and asked plainly how the wall had been built. Halvard explained it the way he understood it best, not as magic or luck, but as air being given somewhere to go instead of being trapped. He explained the small openings, the shavings packed for insulation, and the mistake he had made in October before correcting it in November, a mistake he did not try to hide from a man who had warned him it might happen. Otis listened longer than he had listened to anything Halvard said all autumn, and when he left, he did not offer congratulations. He only said that he might come back in the spring, with questions about how much lumber a similar wall would take for his own house, a request that meant more in that valley than any apology ever could. The double wall did not spread through the valley overnight, and it did not turn Halvard Solberg into a wealthy man. What it earned him instead was something closer to trust, the kind that accumulates slowly, house by house, conversation by conversation, over several winters, rather than one dramatic season. By the following autumn, 2 other families had built similar walls, adapting Halvard's design to their own cabins, adjusting the size of the air gap and the placement of the ventilation openings based on their own north or south-facing walls. None of them called it engineering. Most simply called it the Norwegian's Wall, a name that stuck long after anyone remembered exactly why. Peter, older now and steadier in his understanding of the work, helped his father build 2 of those later walls for neighboring families, learning firsthand the patience the design demanded, the willingness to be wrong in October, so a family could be warm in December. Elias grew stronger through the following winters, his cough fading as the seasons passed, though whether that was the wall's doing entirely or simply time, no one could say for certain, and Halvard never claimed more credit than the evidence allowed. Otis eventually built his own version, smaller and simpler, on the coldest side of his ranch house, and he never once mentioned the jokes he had made in October, the same way no one in the valley seemed to mention them anymore either. What Halvard had built was never beautiful. The boards were uneven in places, the ventilation openings small and easy to miss unless someone pointed them out. But the wall was patient, giving winter fewer places to take warmth from a family that had already lost enough, and in a valley that measured a man's worth by what survived the season. That kind of patience turned out to be worth more than anyone had expected on the day the second wall began going up. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.